to this very special Thai webinar on thought economics, conversations with remarkable people shaping our century. This will be a fireside chat between Ashok Rao from Thai Houston and Vikas Shah. I'll let Ashok introduce Vikas in a minute. But before I do so, I'd like to welcome the entire audience. Our audience comprises Thai Charter members, members of the general community and Thai general members. For those of you who are new to Thai, let me just say a few words about Thai. Thai is the largest global organization of entrepreneurs and corporate entrepreneurs, comprising over 15,000 charter members spread around chapters in 61 different countries across the world. We undertake a number of activities around fostering entrepreneurship, mentoring, angel investing, education, and so forth. In order to do so, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors. If you could go to the next slide, please, Samia, who are named on this slide. Without our sponsors and our corporate members who pay their subscription dues, those provide us the resources to undertake the myriad activities we undertake in the community, such as in the last few weeks, a very successful Rice Business Plan competition and Thai Prize, and a very, very successful Thai University Pitch Fest that occurred last weekend. We thank all of you on this slide and our charter members for not only supporting us, but also making our presence as strong as it currently is. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ashok Rao, who needs really no introduction to many of you in Thai, although I will say this, given the bio he gave me, I can't possibly do justice. It'll probably take me about 25 minutes to go through it all. But there are a few things I learned, even though I've known him for a few years right now. And I think it would be interesting for me to cover a few highlights here. And I think there are three things I'd like you to remember about Ashok. The first is he's an incredibly successful serial entrepreneur with over 5 successful tech startups. An early milestone of his was founding Midcom Communications in 1990 and becoming one of the very first Indian Americans to take a company public on the NASDAQ. And since then, he's founded and had successful exits with multiple other tech startups. And to describe it as tech is really not doing justice because it spans life sciences, artificial intelligence, energy chemistry, and other fields. And so he's really had a very, very diverse, successful business career. And that leads to the second thing that I'd like you to remember, which is the pivotal role he's played in the history of the Thai Houston chapter and indeed in Thai Global. And it really comes to his activities around giving back to the community on entrepreneurship. He's a member of the prestigious Goose Society. That's a group of super angel investors, the grand order of successful investors. And he's also been a foundational pillar of the Houston Thai for, I would say, over 20 years, being a president in the early years of this chapter, and subsequently serving 2 terms as chairman of Thai Global from 2011 to 2014. And in that role, he's probably been the linchpin of the mentoring activity of the Thai Houston chapter for many more years than I actually, much more than even my presence in Houston at all. If we are successful today in our mentoring activities, in large part through the immense amount of time and effort he has spent over a decade or maybe 15 years in fostering it and pulling other people together. As a result, he's been an angel investor in many startups. I think he's currently involved in over 12 or 13 right now. And you know, if a successful business career and a successful angel investor and entrepreneur isn't enough, he's got the final thing that I would say is the number of eclectic other interests, many of which I didn't know, that he's engaged in. So one of the things I think a number of us know is he's owner of Songkran Thai, but I didn't know that he was a film producer and has had 4 award-winning films. I didn't know that he'd received awards for arts advocacy in Houston and the advancement, a different award for math and science education in the school districts. And he's, of course, been involved in numerous other philanthropic pursuits. And if that's not enough, he also has hobbies like travel, golf, tennis, and guitar. I think many of us in Thai Houston know him first and foremost for the pivotal role he's played in the Houston chapter, and for that, we thank you. And Ashok, I'm really looking forward to hearing your interrogation of Vikas on what is truly a fascinating set of interviews. Over to you, Ashok.
Oh, well, thank you, Ram. And you know, this evening's about Vikas. Before I get into introducing Vikas and all of his formidable accomplishments, let me give you some personal disclaimers. I'm unabashedly prejudiced fan when it comes to this talented young man. My wife and I have kind of adopted him as one of our own, him and his wife, Rachel. I first met Vikas 12 years ago when I was invited to speak at the Global Entrepreneurship Forum. I went on right before Sir Richard Branson. I was kind of Branson's warm-up act. But while I was busy with the conference, the president of Thai Manchester appointed Vikas as my wife's chauffeur and caretaker. And that encounter started a lifelong friendship. So now a little bit about Vikas. And there's a lot we could say, but we have lots of interesting stuff to get to. But he's a serial entrepreneur. He's a philanthropist. He's also an educator. He's a visiting professor at the MIT Sloan School campus in Lisbon. He has at the University of Manchester and the Salford School of Business. He's also been granted the MBA from Her Majesty the Queen for distinguished service to the Crown in 2018. He owns a business called Swisscot. He's also on several philanthropic boards, and he is what Sir Thomas More would once have called a man for all seasons. So welcome to this webinar, Vikas. Welcome to Thai Houston.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you know, as they say, it's great to be had, isn't it?
I've been very excited about today, so I've been very much looking forward to it.
Indeed. I have been, as you know, since 2010, been tracking your stuff on thought economics on and off, and I have been absolutely blown away by some of the people you have interviewed. So let me ask you first, where did thought economics come from, and why did you decide to do this?
So my first business, like many years ago, was in technology, and the publishing world kind of in the early 2000s was changing. So I love reading, you know, big, long, detailed, long form articles. And when publishing went online, all of that changed and everything became, you know, short form, soundbite content, infographics. It wasn't what I enjoyed. So I just literally went onto Google, onto Blogger, and I set up a blog called thoughteconomics.blogspot.com, you know, really off the shelf stuff. And the aim was initially just interviewing a few people that I met at different conferences. And it was initially really focused on economics and banking and finance. And I just realized I enjoyed it. It was just kind of fun speaking to people. And then one day I just thought, okay, you know, who can I get to? And I managed to procure the email address of Jimmy Wales, who founded Wikipedia. He gave me a shot. I had a, you know, great conversation with him. And then I got really cheeky, and I thought, okay, who else can I get to? And really early doors, right at the start of this project, Buzz Aldrin gave me an hour of his time. And then I was hooked. And at that point, I was like, I just have to follow this thread and see where it goes.
Buzz Aldrin,
so there was no plan.
Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. That Buzz Aldrin.
Yeah. Literally, you know, pestering the NASA press office until they put me in touch with his people. We scheduled a time, and then this was when I knew that there was something odd that I was doing here, because, you know, I'm sat at the office. It was it'd been a busy day. It's kind of maybe 7 p.m. or so UK time, and I'm just sort of waiting in the office, and I'm like dialing the number, put me through, and then I hear like, hello, and it's like, I'm on the phone to Buzz Aldrin. This is ridiculous. And that was the moment where I just thought, I have to keep going with this.
Yeah.
Who
That was
else can I get to?
2007 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like 2007, 2008.
Yeah. So we'll get to a lot of your interviews now, but you then ended up a year and a half ago writing this book. And you see all of these little yellow tags. These are questions I'm not going to ask you, because these are questions that I want to ask you, but we won't have the time. The question that I'm going to ask you, but I am going to ask you these questions offline. So what happened was, when Vikas wrote this book, he compiled about 20% of all of the interviews you've done into this book. You've still got 80% more?
Probably more. So to give you an idea, that's about 90,000 words ish, right? There's 1.42 million words of content left. So over the years, I've interviewed maybe 450-ish people so far. And in the book, there's about 120. So all the full interviews are online. So each interview is like maybe an hour. So the full interviews are online. And this was the hard bit, was compressing it into kind of real key learnings and key bits of the interview, which then made it in.
I'm going to ask you about that. But first I want to say, he sent me the book, he signed it, and then I read it. And after I read it, I said, my goodness, I got to read it again, because there are so many threads in this book. They're not just the transcript of your interview. And then, of course, to get ready for today, I read it a third time. And I've got to tell everybody who's on this, go get the book. This is not a commercial for Vikas's book. It's a commercial for your own learning. There is so much to learn by reading this book. The question then comes up, how the hell did you get to all of these people? I mean, these are the who's who of our planet. So and we'll get to the who's who in a bit. But the question is, how did you get to them?
So it's really weird. I think I was reflecting on this during the process, and I genuinely think that, you know, when I started the first, like we all did, you know, so many people on this call are entrepreneurs. And when I started my first business, I was kind of responsible for sales, right? I had to bring in the bacon, as they say. And the thing that I learned about that was you always find a way in. You have to find a way in to get to the person you need to speak to. And it was basically the same principle. Like if I said, right, I want to speak to Noam Chomsky, it was finding a way in through every route, the publicist, the dean's office, any route I could, just to get someone to read my pitch. And then if they say no, that's fine. But until I get a flat out no, I will keep going. And but it takes a lot of rejections as well, right? So for everyone that said yes, so, you know, for every Maya Angelou, there's like 20 people that said, no, it's not for us. But that's fine, because those 20 people that said no were the gift that got me the hour with Maya Angelou. So in the end, it works out. But I really believe that the skills, the sales skills you get in business, that's the key to getting in front of people. Yeah,
but that's all fine and dandy. I've run large sales forces and none of them did any of what you're saying. How did you get a hold of these people?
So very rarely through the publicist, because publicists' default setting is no, because they're there to protect the client. And I'm not the New York Times or someone, and I get it, right? So usually I find another route. So I'll give you an example. So will.i.am, who was amazing. Obviously, his publicity team were like, who are you? No, go away, shoot. So I actually ended up connecting with somebody on LinkedIn who used to own a company that he'd invested in Israel. So, and I said to this guy, look, you know, the reason I connected you is I run this project called Thought Economics. I'd love to speak to Will. I think he'd be really good for it. Could you just point me in the right direction? And he was like, oh, this sounds fun. Here's Will's assistant. Just tell her that we've spoken. So he gave me a shot, right? And it's always a route like that. It's very rarely the obvious route. You know, sometimes I'll find their home address and write to them and say, here's what I do.
I've got a thought. Does your plummy British accent help you?
Maybe.
Yeah?
Maybe. I think sometimes it does, because, you know, there's the international factor of, oh, it's a publication from somewhere else. And, you know, the more people that you interview, the more prestige the publication gets. And, it's won a few awards. So I was a finalist for 6 years in a row for a Webby, and the Webby is like the biggest award for internet sites. And for 6 years in a row, I was a Webby finalist alongside people like the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Vogue for editorial quality. So all of these things kind of add that mystique of credibility to what you're doing and help you get over the line, because it's really hard, especially because when you're going after, household names, it is really, really hard.
Okay, so I've read it in your book, but how did you come up with Thought Economics?
So it was odd. I was sat there thinking, okay, if I'm going to speak to all these people, I need a title. I don't want it just to be called like the VCAS blog, because that's a bit disingenuous. And we went through this whole period of time, the industrial era, where the whole world was kind of, machines were our economy. But the world that we're in now is the world of ideas. So the thing that really matters now are ideas and concepts, whether it's the idea of democracy, the idea of freedom, the idea of the knowledge economy. And so that's where the name came from, for Thought Economics, and it kind of just stuck.
Okay, so one quick question before we get to some of the most interesting people in your book, as well as that are not in your book. Has there been a difference in the interviewing comfort and style and availability pre-COVID and post-COVID?
Yeah, so the biggest difference, weirdly, is about platforms. So pre-COVID, the interviews were normally done with me on a speakerphone with my dictaphone recording it. Because normally, pre-COVID, if I actually said to people, look, can we do it over Skype or can we do it over Zoom? They were like, no, that's just a lot of effort. I can't be bothered with that. So the default position was, we'll do it by phone. As soon as COVID hit and the world went virtual, now all the interviews are done via Zoom or via some other streaming platform. So it just changes the dynamic, because when you see somebody face to face, the whole style changes. Your approach to the interview changes. It's much more human, right? So that's been, I think, a really big gift in terms of how I approach it. And it makes it kind of fun, because then, you're sat there waiting on Zoom, and then,
Mark
Cuban or Matthew McConaughey suddenly connects, and you're just like,
the guy you see on Shark Tank and on all the TV shows, yes. So anyway, before we get to some more stuff, I just want to play some word games with you. That'll give the audience a little flavor for how the kind of people you've talked to, the kind of input you've got from them, the knowledge, and also your own involvement. So we'll play a word. I'll give you two names. They're similar. You got to tell me who you prefer and what you got from each of them and why you prefer the person you prefer. I'm really putting you on the spot. You okay with that?
Okay. I'm cool with that. I
start with two people who you and I have both met. So Richard Branson and Mark Cuban.
Mark Cuban, any day.
Why?
And the reason is, so they've both obviously been astonishingly successful entrepreneurs. But Mark Cuban is him. He is him. He is himself. He's not a media trained kind of, when you ask him a question, he will tell you what he thinks, not what his media training tells him to think. And that to me is much more useful. Whereas Sir Richard Branson, phenomenally intelligent guy, great fun to speak to, but you kind of get the sound bites. And I kind of want the better conversation. And Mark Cuban's just cool as hell anyway. So I'd go with Mark.
And Branson is.
And he's a Texan.
Yeah. But what did you learn from both of them, that your key takeaways from Cuban and Branson?
So with Branson, it was just the power of following the thread. So, I've interviewed him twice and kind of spoken to him about this topic. And what I found really inspiring was that even though he has, a successful business, he will follow the thread of an idea, follow the thread of a concept and see where that goes. And sometimes they work. He's very open about talking about failure, and a lot of times they don't. But I love that he's prepared to actually try it. And with Mark Cuban, it was actually kind of similar. It was just the attitude that he brings, that kind of positivity, that absolute fire that he brings of, you need to win. You need to keep winning. You need to keep going. That resilience piece, I think from him, I really took that in the interview.
And Cuban?
No, Cubans. So
Oh,
with
George,
Cuban, that's what I mean. Yeah, so Cuban, it was just fire, like that real resilience, that real passion for doing it. So, and that is so important.
Switching complete tracks, two people who really helped change the world. One helped bring down the Berlin Wall and the Cold War, and one helped end apartheid. You know who I'm talking. Lech Walesa and F.W. de Klerk.
Wow. It's
Both Nobel Prize winners.
So the reason I'm going to choose de Klerk, and the reason I choose de Klerk is I picked, when I interviewed him, the reason I interviewed him and didn't approach Mandela was because I found it really fascinating that he had changed his mind in such a public way. And we could all learn a lot from that, because he went from one position to the other in a position of high office with a lot of people who disagreed with him, because he realized it was the right thing to do for him, his people, and his country. And I found that really, really fascinating. And Lech Walesa, he's just a really interesting peace builder, because again, what he taught me when I interviewed him was about the fact that it's about reaching out and finding the similarities between people, not focusing on the differences. So he was, again, really fascinating. But de Klerk, as an example of someone who changed his mind to create something for the greater good, I think he's a real inspiration. And I was just, again, very lucky to get time with him.
I agree. Did you get a sense that he regretted some of the blood that was on his hand in the earlier days of his presidency of South Africa?
No, but he seemed to be regretful for what had happened in South Africa since, where to the extent that he'd made a decision for what he believed was the greater good of South Africa. And he seemed to feel regretful about the fact that a lot of what he was expecting to change in South Africa didn't, around getting a better deal for the Black community there. So there was that. I suspect he probably does feel some regret for what happened, but that's pure conjecture. Mm-hmm. I don't have any basis for that, because even if he did, he's not going to tell me.
Yeah.
But I genuinely think he probably did.
Okay, great. I mean, two unbelievable people who iconic and big, both helped change the world. Now let's switch tacks again to sports. I know you've gotten two of the all-time great Hall of Famers in Usain Bolt and Shaquille O'Neal.
Shaquille O'Neal.
Usain Bolt.
Shaquille O'Neal is just brilliant. I mean, so when I connected with him on the call, he was walking back to his car in the middle of a call, plugs it in, and then we're doing the interview whilst he's basically driving around, and he's just cool. Like, he exudes charisma. He is exactly what you would expect from him. And but he's also just, you learn the more you speak to somebody. When you're talking to somebody for half an hour, 40 minutes, you do learn. And he is an astute business person. He studied law. He went on to do an MBA. He is an incredible thinker in his own right. And I found that really inspiring, the fact that he's got such a breadth of interests and such a passion for all of them. Usain Bolt, again, he's just fun and he loves what he does, but he is kind of, if you like, a very mono-dimensional character. It's like he has this one thing which he loves more than anything else on the planet, and that's that. And again, that's inspiring to get to know in a different way.
But what would you have learned from Usain Bolt? I can see what you learned from Shaq, but what would you have learned from your conversation with, probably unarguably the greatest runner of all time?
So with him, the learning was, there was two things. The first thing was that success is not as resolved as we think it is, because the people that we think are successful very rarely themselves feel that same thing. I said to even when I asked Shaq the same question, he was similar. So Usain Bolt doesn't feel like he is the icon that we put on the stage. He still feels like that runner at the beginning of his career, still starting out, still trying to keep going, still trying to build resilience and still keep winning. So for him, there's that sense of always chasing something. And the reflection for me was the fact that actually, if I think about my own journey, it doesn't matter what people say about me. I don't believe it, so I keep going. And it's the same in so many professions.
Okay, now let's switch genders to two of the most influential women on earth. One who seems to be more in it for others, and one who seems kind of in it, you know who I'm headed for. Melinda Gates and Sheryl Sandberg.
I mean, Melinda, yeah, I mean, so they're both incredible for different reasons. So Sheryl Sandberg, so I'd pick Melinda out of the two in terms of who would be my guest at a dinner party, but Sheryl Sandberg was a necessary grown-up pair of hands at Facebook when they needed it the most. There is no way that business would have scaled the way it did with the systems and processes it did without Sheryl. Simply no way, because she was that. She brought that to the business. What Melinda Gates, I think, has done is the fact that she isn't just Bill's wife. You know, she is a ferocious intellect who, in her own right, has led and executed some of the most dramatic and impactful philanthropic work that the world has ever seen. And that, you know, and tackling topics which were taboo in the countries where they delivered. And, you know, you could write a book on the inspiring things that she has been able to do in terms of global change. And I think we can all take inspiration from that.
Okay, and they're both extraordinary women, extraordinary people, clearly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Staying with extraordinary people, let's go to the Indian subcontinent and two actresses. And you know who I'm going to ask you about. First is, of course, a real, true, let's say, game-changing kind of actress, Vidya Balan, who you had from the interview I've read, was a fascinating interview. And the other one is Sunny Leone.
Okay, so I would choose Vidya Balan because the depth of experience that she brings.
No pun intended.
Exactly. She's brought such a lot of experience to the interview. So she has really understood the craft of acting and the craft of playing a character. And that's wisdom, right? And particularly with the arts, I love the interviews where you get the wisdom, and that comes from experience. Sunny Leone, you know, she's a really interesting character because she's turned her life around. You know, she started out as an adult film star, you know, had not inconsiderable success in that world, allegedly. And then she's made it in Bollywood, and she's transformed her image, transformed her life, and has become a very well-respected actress in a whole different format. So she was also very interested to get her take on Bollywood, but Vidya Balan was just, you know, a wealth of wisdom and experience, and that made for an interesting interview.
And how did you manage to get either or both of them sitting in Manchester, and, you know, they're Bollywood stars, and that to me would be, you'd have to be connected in the film.
So there's connections within connections within connections, right? So I'll tell you a little story. So I interviewed a guy that some of you may have heard of called Vikas Khanna. So Vikas Khanna, he's quite a famous Indian chef. He was the first Indian chef to get Michelin stars for his restaurant in New York. He's got restaurants all over the world, but he's also the main chef on MasterChef in India. So we were in Goa for your daughter's wedding, and then we stopped off in Mumbai on the way back, and I get a message on Twitter from Vikas Khanna saying, "Oh, I didn't know you were in Mumbai," and I'm like, "I didn't know you were in Mumbai." So he goes, "Look, we're on set. Just come say hey." So I was like, "Oh, may as well." So me and Rachel jumped in a taxi and we went to the MasterChef set, and we hung out. We had some food, we had some tea. It was really good fun, and he was like, "Oh, I love your site. What else are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, well, I keep thinking about doing a piece on Bollywood because it's really interesting." And he goes, "Well, Vidya Balan's one of my best friends. Do you want to speak to her?" And I was like, "Sure." I thought nothing else of it. By the time that we'd got from the MasterChef studios back to, we were going for dinner that evening to the restaurant. He'd emailed Vidya copying me in saying, I think you should do this. And also emailed Ritesh Kumar and said, I think you should do this. And so all of a sudden I had, you know, a lineup of Bollywood royalty to do interviews with, which was amazing, which was really great. Just connections within connections.
Well, this next one is not, I'm not going to play the word game, but I really did want you to get to two people that when I read your book, and I've also listened to the podcast with these two people because they just blew me away, are two people who harken back to World War II. A Holocaust survivor and the chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials, Ibn Kamil and,
Ben
Ferenc, friend, yeah.
So
talk to me about those two, because everybody and anybody who's on this call, if you're going to listen to two podcasts, at least from my perspective, those are the two to listen to.
I went through a period of time. So when they were doing the centenary commemoration, so the World War I centenary, it made me realize that, you know, Europe and, well, the world, the whole world went through two of, you know, the most brutal wars that hopefully we will ever see. But the generation who fought for those freedoms are now at an age where they're not going to be here so long for the generation that follows, or even for our generation for that matter. So I started to research, who can I speak to? First of all, people who'd been impacted by the Nazi atrocities, so hence the camps, and the people that then were part of the restitution, the peace building. Ben Ferenc, at the time he was 93, he was chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, you know, tasked with one of the most important judiciary roles in the history of the law. And it was just fascinating speaking to him about it and trying to understand how you can separate people from the action. You know, you're prosecuting people for a crime, and you know that that crime was abhorrent, but you're still prosecuting them for a crime under the law. And that was an inspiring skill. And I think it's an important skill because it removes the emotion from it and make sure that people do get a fair trial irrespective. Ibby Nil, I've interviewed three of the Holocaust survivors. Ibby Nil was survived Auschwitz, and she actually didn't speak about her experiences for most of her life until she was in her 80s. And then she started talking about what she went through. And when I spoke to Ibby, you know, we spoke in general about what happened and what it meant. And then there was a point in the interview where we'd built a bit of a rapport. And I actually said to her, so Ibby, you know, what do you think about your captors? What did you think about the people that held you hostage at Auschwitz? And she actually said to me, do you know what? They were doing their job. I forgive them.
Yes.
They were the product of a system. They weren't bad people. And I didn't know what to say because my life was never going to be the same after she said that, right? Imagine she saw her family slaughtered, and yet after seeing that, being at Auschwitz, she had the power to forgive, right? Based on that fact, I should never have the power to hate. So that one 15-second answer she gave me, you know, was life-changing. And that happens so much in this kind of work.
Yeah, but because from what I learned from reading and listening to her, it took her 3 years after being liberated to get to that. She said that it helped because of her husband, who was a World War I survivor, really helped her through the 3 years after liberation.
Yeah, and she didn't speak for about 3 or 4 years at all, like as in did not speak, period, because of what she'd been through. And then it took her 60 years before she even spoke about what happened at Auschwitz. Even her children, her grandchildren had no idea.
Yeah, a remarkable.
And then basically, I actually asked her why she decided to, and it was pretty simple. You know, she said that she was at an age where it was important for her to say what happened to prevent it happening again. And she was worried the reason she started talking about Auschwitz was because she was so worried seeing what was happening to today's world, to today's youth, that she felt that she owed it to society to talk about what happened to try and prevent it happening again.
Yeah.
But those two, I mean, genuinely, there's a few people in the book and on the website that I just feel so blessed to have been able to speak to, and they are two of those.
Okay, because in what you just talked about, you answered one of the questions PK asked, which is, how have all these interviews influenced you personally? And I mean, I'm blown away by the fact that if she could learn to forgive, you have learned not to hate. That's marvelous, marvelous.
It's very, it's an overused phrase, but people talk about gurus, right? They talk about these people that imbue you with wisdom. And probably for me personally, and I'm being very selfish here, the single most joyous part of this whole thought economics journey is I get to have an hour on the phone with some of the greatest people that have ever lived and ask them what I want to ask them. So it's like I get to visit these gurus on all these mountains and ask them my questions. Like that shouldn't happen, right? But that's an amazing privilege that I get. So I ask them the things that are on my mind, and I ask them the things that I want to know. And so with a lot of people, you do the interview and it changes you because you're speaking to that wisdom. So it happens a lot, but then on certain times, so, like with Ibi Nil, like with Ben Ferencz, like with Maya Angelou, you get, a real transformation.
So clearly Ibn Kamil and Ben Ferencz are two of the most interesting people. But my question that I prepared to ask you was, what is the most interesting interview you've had out of the 500 odd that you've done so far? The most, number one in your mind, if you can go to a number one.
Do you know, it's, and I'm not saying this just to kind of avoid the question. I genuinely don't know, because depending on my mood and depending on the time, that changes.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now, the world's in a lot of turmoil right now, with what's happening in the US, what's happening here. And in those moments, I reflect on when I was talking to Noam Chomsky and what he was saying about how the world works. And then sometimes, I'll be out exploring or on a hike and I'll think about some of the explorers I've spoken to. So
Bear Grylls, for instance.
Bear Grylls, he was amazing. So the whole point, I guess, of Thought Economics as a book was that, which is whatever your mood is and whatever's kind of on your mind, I want people to be able to dig in and find some inspiration at the time.
So what's the funniest interview you've had?
Oh God, there's the funny bits are the bits that don't make it onto the website, right? So here's why. So I get a slot, and you send all the questions, blah, blah, blah. And then, so there you are at whatever time it is, you're about to connect on a call with somebody. You're like interview 6 that they've done that day. They don't want to be there. You need to warm them up, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's been so many occasions where just before an interview, we've just been having a laugh. Like I'll give you one example. So I'm just going to get a little prop that I've prepared earlier. So Matthew McConaughey connects on Zoom. Yes. And I could tell straight away, I'm like, ugh, like he just looked a bit tired and a bit like, let's just get this over and done with. And so I got his book and I was like, listen, we're trying to get the same hair. And it just warmed him up. We started laughing. We started having a bit of a chat. And then he's like, look, let's go. And so there's so many occasions where.
And how was that interview with McConaughey, potentially the future governor of Texas,
Yeah. And he was genuinely one of my favorites, because he's not what you would expect. He's a deep philosophical thinker. He's very values driven. He's got this kind of warmth and charm, which is rare. Like it's really rare that you can feel utterly charmed by somebody via Zoom. It's a rare skill, but he's a brilliant person, actually, really brilliant thinker.
There's a question that came on the chat site, because what is the most disappointing interview you've done?
Wow.
Good question, huh?
So there's quite a few interviews that never made it on to the site, right? For various reasons, but oftentimes there's interviews where you connect to the call, and within a couple of minutes, I literally have to say to the interviewee, look, if you're not feeling it, let's just not bother, because it's not working. So I think it'd be a bit cruel for me to name people, but for example, there's been people, for example, on Shark Tank in the UK, where I've interviewed a couple of them, and I've like 2 or 3 minutes in, I'm just like, let's just quit, because this isn't working. I don't want to waste my time or their time. Sorry?
How was Kevin O'Leary? I knew you interviewed him.
Kevin O'Leary,
Mr. Wonderful Shark Tank.
so he was exactly as he is on Shark Tank. Like, I don't know whether that is him or whether he plays a character, but I asked him why he invests in businesses, and he's like, well, they get me and I'm amazing and I can make them money. And so he was arrogant, but also in a weirdly charming way, if you know what I mean. But he was fun. He was fun to speak to. Weirdly enough, he was the first, when I did my, everyone in the book has got a copy of the book. And he was one of the first people that emailed me back when he'd got his copies and said, I love it. Can I have 5 more?
Okay. For free?
No, I replied and I sent him the link to buy it on Barnes and Noble. He's a billionaire. He doesn't need me to send him a free book.
Yeah. But you know what? Those are the kind of people who ask for free books.
Of course they are.
Yeah, I want to make a comment to the audience that's listening. You probably, hopefully all ready to go out and buy the book if you don't already have it. This is the book, Thought Economics. This is not a pitch that I'm making, but I want to tell you one thing that blew me away in the book. It's not just all the people, the entrepreneurs, the business giants, the thinkers, the artists, the musicians, the poets, the diplomats, the world changers. But the best part of the book is the stuff Vikas wrote himself. I was blown away. I knew Vikas was talented, but he does a sort of an introduction to a chapter and a summary to the chapter. And those should be published on their own, because they are superbly written. And they capture, for instance, the stuff that you wrote on leadership at the end of the chapter was better than anything anyone had said. So that's my little 2 cents.
The you know what's funny? It's weird, because that was the bit that I thought was going to be the hardest, right? So every chapter in the book, and there's 7 chapters, and the publisher said to me, look, we need you to do kind of an opener for every chapter to set the scene. And that was the bit that I was quite scared of writing, because I'm like, God, like, what am I going to do? But it's funny, because when you sit down and think of the kind of acquired wisdom of doing all the interviews in that topic, you do find the thread to create that intro. And the leadership one in particular was an exciting chapter, because I started to think about what are the most interesting forms of leadership and types of leadership. So I spoke to a huge amount of the world's most prominent, retired and serving military leaders, like Stan McChrystal and people like that. And I also interviewed the person who I genuinely to this day think has the best job title in the world, who is the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO.
Correct.
Like, I want that job title somehow.
Supreme Allied Commander, right.
No.
Wesley Clark was another. There's a question here, which is an excellent question, which was on my list as well. But let me say it's from Paresh Patel. Who would be your moonshot interviewee? One that you haven't done that you absolutely would like to do.
Great question. So I've got like on my laptop, I've got like a little list just in notes of people that I'm trying to reach. And what I keep doing is, as I get another step closer, I update my list with a bit more information. And I mean, there's a few. So Obama's definitely on there, and his press office do reply, and we do chat, and they keep saying, look, timing's not right, reapproach us in X month, and I always do. So hopefully one day. Bill Gates, I think, is on there as well, which is it. I know it's an obvious one. I definitely would love to speak to Elon Musk, because he's a bit strange, and weirdly enough, he is responding to my emails.
Yes.
So I'll email him.
He is strange.
Yeah. So I emailed him once, and he replied just with no. And I was like, Okay. And then I emailed him again and said, look, I'd love to speak to you. Here's a load of people that I've interviewed. And he literally replied with, I don't care who you've interviewed. Fine. So I will get him one day. But there are people who are making an outsized impact in our world who I'd love to speak to. But one thing that I'm definitely conscious of is quite naturally, I interview a lot of people that I agree with, right? So a lot of people in the book have the same political leaning as me, the same social leaning as me. And I really also want to speak to the people that don't. I want to speak to people on the opposite side of the aisle from me, because I think that's important too. So this year, I've got my dream list of people that I don't agree with that I'd love to interview. So
Who's on top of that list?
You'll disconnect if I tell you.
No, that's okay.
So well, I'll put it this way: I would speak to Trump,
Okay,
and I would speak to
Biden. I thought he
Bannon.
would be on your list on number 1 or number 2. Boris Johnson maybe number 1.
I definitely speak to Steve Bannon. I just feel like our century has been shaped by hate as much as it's been shaped by peace, and it's been shaped by conflict as much as it's been shaped by people coming together. And so those perspectives are interesting and important. And when I publish things, I don't do any editorialization. I just publish the transcript of the interview. You know, who am I to make a judgment on it?
Yes. Well, before we get to next, a shout out to Satish Shah, our friend who just bought your book.
Thank you.
He just bought it on Amazon.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Satish. There's a request for people to get the link to your website and your podcast.
Yeah. So everything's on thoughtseconomics.com. So all the interviews that I've ever done are on there. So just today, literally today, I published an interview with Terry Virts, who was one of the longest ever commanders on ISS. Fascinating guy. We talked about everything from aliens to faith to what it's really like to fly. So he was great. So everything's on there.
And people can get on your mailing list where you send out when you've talked. Yeah. So how do people get on that mailing list?
So right on the top of the website, there's a little box for your email. It's all free. You know, there's no ads, there's no subscription. It's all on there. So, and I'll do an interview every couple of weeks with someone, different topics every time, and send them out.
Sometimes more than one in a week come out. I've seen sometimes you do 1 or 2 in the same week.
Yeah. If I'm having a quiet week, I'll do a few more.
We have a question from another one of our mutual close friends, Christian, who says, when is your next Thought Economics number 2 coming out?
So I don't know. I don't know if, I think it would need to be something really specific. So one of the questions that I ask everyone that I interview right at the end of the interview is, what does legacy mean to you? Because it's all well and good me saying you've changed the world. Like, for example, I'll show you, like yourself, you know, I can look at you externally and look at the impact you've made on the world. And, you know, we heard your bio before and it's incredible, but that's very different to what you think your impact is in the world and what your legacy is. And so I've asked everybody that I've interviewed, what does legacy mean? And I have thought that maybe the next Thought Economics book is actually about that one question of legacy and what does that mean?
Brilliant. There's a question from your adopted mom. Is there a personal mantra or thought process that you have developed from interviewing these extraordinarily brilliant people?
Yeah, do you know, it's ask big questions, because big questions stretch the intellect, right? So for example, it would be really, you know, we mentioned Matthew McConaughey before, so I'll use him as an example. It would be really easy for me to say, oh, Matthew, you were in this film and I remember this scene. Why did you do that? And I can get a very specific answer. But if I want to really learn something, I need to ask a big question, like, why do you act? You know, what does beauty mean to you? What's the meaning of life to you? Because I think when you ask big questions, you can get interesting answers. So in terms, and I apply that outside the interviews now as well, because that's when you really find out what makes the world work.
Yeah, so what are people, let's say you could travel through time. What person in history would be, what top 3 would be the ones you'd want to interview?
So one of them is a patently obvious one, which is Steve Jobs, because I think Steve Jobs, he was a genius. I interviewed Philip Stark recently, who is like one of the greatest designers in the history of design, who said Steve Jobs was a god. That was his words. I've always been fascinated by conflict, because I think conflict is quite a raw expression of humanity. So I would love to interview someone like Churchill. And this is going to sound really weird. I would also be fascinated to speak to people like Hitler, because
sure,
by understanding the minds of some of the most abhorrent people in humanity, we can prevent that happening again.
Yes. There's a question in here that I skipped over, and I didn't mean to. It is, what religious leaders have you spoken to?
Great question. So I spoke to Sadhguru, who was really fascinating.
He's in your book a bit.
I also did a really interesting piece, and it's not one that was in the book, but I did quite a big piece on thought economics around religion versus science. And I spoke to the Vatican's chief scientist, who's actually, a deeply religious person, as you would expect. Also interviewed the former Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK. It's interesting. I'd like to do more interviews with religious leaders, but they are extraordinarily hard to reach, because they have got so many layers of people around them, him or her, who don't want you to speak to them. Last time I was in Texas, so when I was last in Texas, which is where I would live if I didn't live in Manchester, I was this close to being able to interview Joel Osteen whilst I was there.
Wow.
Like this close. And in the end, schedules didn't work out, because I just want to know how he gets his teeth that white. It just doesn't make sense. That's all I want to know. One question, and then I'm done.
This is not purely religion, but it relates to religion, because I think that was the most interesting excerpt in your chapter on identity, was from Steven Pinker.
Yeah.
God and morality, and that in and of itself is worth the book. So talk to me a little bit about, explain who Steven Pinker is for people who don't know.
Steven Pinker is quite genuinely one of the greatest thinkers alive. I mean, he's a professor at Harvard, but Stanford, sorry, but more than that, he understands the way that society works, and he spent his entire career writing books to explain our world and explain what is and isn't real. So he wrote an incredible book that talked about the fact that, we look at the world as being this horrible, awful place that's on fire, but we've made such huge progress as a civilization that we should never forget that. And I've forgotten the name of the book. It'll come to me, but that is a brilliant new book he's done. But one of the big battles, I think, that contemporary civilizations faced has been, what does it mean to be a human in a world where God doesn't exist? Or indeed, what does it mean to be a person of faith in a world that ostensibly has become secular? Like I did an interview quite recently, so it's not in the book, with a professor of philosophy who has spent his entire life studying death and studying the social constructs and culture around death. And we had an hour-long conversation effectively discussing, what does it mean to die in a world without a God? Because these are fundamental questions we ask ourselves. And for the last several 100,000 years, we have been a civilization that had absolutely no doubt that there was a God, and no doubt in spirit, and no doubt in the creator. And in the past century, that aspect of humanity is all but dissolved. And so figuring out what it means to be human, once that's gone, I think is one of the greatest challenges humanity faces, because so much of our morality was anchored in faith. What do we anchor it in now? And that's where Steven Pinker, and I know somebody's mentioned, Juan's mentioned Richard Dawkins. These are the great thinkers on those topics.
Yeah, but they are on the area of humanity that is not of faith, but still a large swath of humanity is of deep faith.
Correct. So this is where, I'm somebody who straddles the two. Like some days I am, some days I'm not. But I do want to interview more religious thinkers from all religions, because I think they also acknowledge this battle, not a battle in the sense of conflict, but this battle philosophically in civilization.
Mm-hmm. Samya, is there anybody who wants to raise their hand and ask this brilliant young fella a question in person on screen? Raise your hand and ask a question. Otherwise, we'll keep going. What's your next most interesting interviewee coming up, Vikas, that we got to keep our Periscope up?
So I've got an interview that I just did yesterday with Philippe Stark, and that's coming out in a couple of days. He's brilliant. He's so much fun, really deep philosophical thinker. And then later in the year, I'm working on speaking with Arundhati Roy, who is also an incredible thinker. I'm also trying to do a big piece around cricket, because I think cricket's a fascinating sport. So I've got a list of cricketers that I'm reaching out to gradually. But there's a few people I'm working on where, and I don't necessarily want to jinx it, but there's a few kind of really, really big names that I'm working on who I'm hoping to secure over the coming couple of weeks.
Here comes Ani. He has a question in person.
Yes, thanks, because the book is fantastic, and
Thanks,
thank
Ani.
you, Ashok, for covering it so well. One question, because is that kids would gain a lot from a lot of the thinking here. Do you plan to create simpler, just crystallized thoughts, for kids?
What a great question.
Wow. Do you know what? The answer is, it's not something that's occurred to me, but that is actually, I think, a brilliant thing to do with this content.
He has
Because-
planted the seed, hasn't he?
So here's the thing, when we talked about legacy before, most of the time, if anybody wants to read interviews with people like this, you have to pay a subscription or you have to go and buy something. And one of the reasons I wanted Thought Economics to live online is because I feel like those conversations should be out there. And I agree. I think that would be a fascinating thing to do, because kids need to learn all these perspectives. And I'm sure there's a lot of learnings in there for kids. So it's not something that I've thought about before. But I do agree. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. And maybe we can pick that up as a discussion, Ani.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for reference, Ray Dalio's book is also in a kids format, which has got pictures and thoughts, and it's just brilliant.
Principles, such a good book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've planted the seed, and let our dear friend maybe make that his next book.
Maybe.
Maybe. Any other brave attendees who want to ask?
Oops.
Just hold on. I think Ashok.
Has Ashok just dropped out?
I think so. Just a second. He's back.
Maybe, Vikas, I should ask you some more questions then while Ashok is away. So one of the
Hey, Ashok is
yeah,
back.
there he is.
Oh,
You're on mute.
I didn't do
Ashok.
anything, I
Sorry.
promise. I just disappeared. It's kind of like that Avengers movie where
yes.
Thanos snaps his fingers in half.
So do you know, it's kind of interesting. So somebody on the chat just mentioned, Paresh Patel mentioned PBS in the US has had a slot since Charlie Rose went off air. I've had in the last week, I've had 3 different people from the US who've got links to broadcast ask me if I would be willing to have a conversation about turning this into a talk show.
You must. That would be amazing, because
Like that would be incredible. That would maybe get me to Houston.
yeah. Oh yes. And Charlie Rose, notwithstanding all of his egregious faults, was one of the best interviewers of all time, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And he asked simple questions, and that
Yeah.
I think is what does it.
Yes. Any other people? Did I see a question? Oh, this PBS. Yes, came up from Paresh. Anyone other than Ram? Do you have a question?
You know, I am just so impressed by the energy and passion you've pursued this, Vikas. I really have to compliment both of you for
Thank
what
you.
was truly an excellent discussion. I was the one who actually asked about the thought economics. Why thought economics? Where do you go from here?
So the answer is I don't know, and I quite like that because pretty much everything else I've done career-wise has a plan, right? There's my businesses have strategies, and the philanthropy stuff that I'm involved in has plans. I like the fact that this doesn't, and I think that's why it works, because I just keep going with it and see what happens. I never thought I'd do a book. I never thought I'd end up doing magazine columns. And it ended up being this journey. And like I said, I've had people approach me about maybe doing something on as a talk show format. So I don't know, and I actually really like that because it's the only thing that's unstructured in my life.
Yeah, there's Juan asked a question: do you sleep? And so when do you sleep?
Yeah. You should know, Ashok, that normally when we're at your house having drinks, I'm normally the first person to retire. I need my sleep, otherwise I don't function very well.
Yeah. Anyway, the time slot is coming to an end. I know you have a hard stop because you have a 5 a.m. in the morning interview. We're so grateful to the time you've given, and I would suggest that let us know in advance when you're returning to Houston. Of course, we'll know. And
Can't wait.
So Ram and Samya, we could arrange for Vikas to actually do an in-person keynote.
Or an in-person interview with you.
A fireside chat of sorts again.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
No, thank you for the opportunity. I've there's so many familiar faces, and you've made Houston my second home by introducing me to some incredible people and making me feel so at home there. So, thank you to everyone at TiE Houston for the opportunity today, for this wonderful event, and for allowing me to chat about this hobby that went horribly rogue.
And everybody, go buy this book. You will not be sorry. I give you a money back guarantee. From me, not from Vikas. It's worth it, folks. Anyway, I'm sorry we don't have more time. I mean, we could have gone another hour, Vikas, but you need to get your, I've always said, you don't have to sleep any less, Vikas, just sleep faster.
I'll try that one next time.
Okay. Turn it over to Samya and to Ram to close up their event. Thank you both very much for allowing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikas and Ashok. It was truly really thought-provoking and very insightful and so amazingly impressive. Vikas, I think we'll get a lot of repeat views on this. And absolutely, if you come over, whenever you come over in the next 6 months or 12 months, honestly, we'd love to have you anchor a longer physical event, because I'm sure it'll be a sellout event. And we'd love for you to actually take the Charlie Rose slot. I think you do a fantastic job. So thanks to all our attendees. We'll be communicating on next month's webinars. We're still finalizing the details. Thank you all very much, and signing off now. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all the attendees as well.
Thank you.